So tell me, I wanted to jump quickly into the subject of cognitive health and brain health. Why people are certainly interested in this right now at a level that I'm not sure if they were before.
I think you're right. Brain health is having a real moment right now, which I think is incredibly important. I really think since COVID, people felt like their brains were struggling, and you see that from the research as well as just talking to people. People are burned out, an increasing burden of mental health conditions in kids and adolescents. Something like 10 to 20% of adults over 40 feel like their cognitive function has changed or has decreased in some way. Plus, we're projecting that the burden of dementia will increase 2 or 3 times in the next 3 or 4 decades, and that by sort of 2040, 2050, it might be the leading cause of death in many countries around the world.
Welcome back to the 90% Healthy podcast. I'm your co-host, Claudia, and I've got Dawn with me today.
Claudia, it's been a year. It's our 1-year anniversary episode.
It is, and boy, we have a treat for our audience.
I am so excited.
Yes. We have a neuroscientist with us today, and I must say that we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is about brain health, maximizing cognitive function. So, Dr. Tommy Wood, we are thrilled to have you with us.
It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to chat with you guys.
I wanted to do a quick intro because it is definitely worth that couple minutes to introduce the background that you bring forth to our audience. You have been a neuroscientist working with elite level professionals, utilizing various aspects of what you have learned across this industry to really work with world-class athletes. Currently, you're an associate professor of pediatrics and neuroscience at the University of Washington School of Medicine. And you really have been working on brain health across lifespans, from babies born preterm all the way to adults who perhaps experience brain trauma, which we're going to be touching on, and how to really have long-term cognitive function at a level that is optimal and lower the risk of dementia. So we have so much to unpack. You have an incredible framework that you have put together, and you have a book dropping toward the end of March in just a few weeks. So we are very excited to have you on as our anniversary episode. And let's dive in.
Great.
Yeah, so just a little bit of an introduction. The way I met Tommy back when I was at OSU, I had this crazy idea that I should be able to have an athlete come in and we should be able to do blood work, urine acids. We should be able to do a stool sample. I should be able to profile this athlete to say, because listen, my 125 pounder is different than my heavyweight who weighs 200, walks around the room at 235. And we need to figure out a way to zoom in it. So I reached out to a group at that time. It was called Nourish Balance Thrive. I think they're still alive. And Tommy, they referred me to Tommy, and Tommy and I get on the phone and we have this wonderful conversation. Well, then what comes out of this is I get an invitation to go down to a workshop down in Pensacola at the Institute of Human and Machine Cognition. Out of the blue, the director, Dr. Ken Ford, who's turned into a mutual friend for us, says, I hear you know a lot about HRV. Well, this all came from Tommy Wood. And I am so grateful because that was a life-changing event for me. Clearly the peak of my academic work. So Tommy, thank you. And thank you for agreeing to be on the podcast. We're so excited to have you.
Yeah, this is now, several years. We've been good friends and known each other. So I'm excited that we can now meet in this format and chat some more.
So tell me, I wanted to jump quickly into the subject of cognitive health and brain health. And if people may have been following your work or just listening to their favorite podcasts, you are everywhere. And I think you're continue to be, because it's a very important topic. And I'm just curious, in terms of your experience, why people are certainly interested in this right now at a level that I'm not sure if they were before.
I think you're right. Brain health is having a real moment right now, which I think is incredibly important. For a long time, if you're in sort of the wellness spaces, it was maybe more focused on physical aesthetics, weight loss. If you're in some of the more sort of medical longevity fields, you might have talked a lot about cardiovascular disease, maybe cancer. But now, I really think since COVID, felt like their brains were struggling, and you see that from the research as well as just talking to people. People are burned out. There's an increasing burden of mental health conditions in kids and adolescents. Something like 10 to 20% of adults over 40 feel like their cognitive function has changed or has decreased in some way. Plus, we're projecting that the burden of dementia will increase 2 or 3 times in the next 3 or 4 decades, and that by sort of 2040, 2050, it might be the leading cause of death in many countries around the world.
That's
all of this
brutal.
kind of coming together, I think kind of making people feel really acutely about brain health and starting to wonder if there's anything they can do about it.
The thing about brain health that's so interesting is that, we've just gone through a period of war where we've had a lot of people coming back, to our soldiers coming back. And because of some of these explosive events, they can lose limbs. So we have people come back who have lost limbs, but we also have some rather significant concussive injuries that are coming back. And what's interesting is that as someone who loses a leg, both legs and an arm, but still maintains cognitive performance, they're still that same person. But all of a sudden you lose your mind, you lose your soul. And this is what's so difficult for people. And I get it. There's a fear there that I'm excited that you've taken the time to put together the book, The Stimulated Mind. We got an early version of it. It's wonderful. I was thinking about the word I wanted to use to describe it. It's not encyclopedic, meaning that it's so daunting, but it is very complete. I mean, you really go A to Z in this, A to Z in your terms. But you really go A to Z on this. And it's a wonderful tool for someone who really wants to get the playbook for cognitive performance. The Stimulated Mind's the place to do it.
Thanks so much. That was the goal, was to try and really cover the things that are going to be lasting in terms of lifestyle factors and advice and the practical application of those. So this is something that, I guess, to step back a second, a lot of books, as soon as you write them, they're out of date. Right. So my goal was to write something that will be relevant for hopefully, a few years at least to come, because the core things that determine brain health and cognitive function, I think, are always going to be the same. Yeah. But people have a huge amount of power and agency over those things.
So it comes out March 24th, but you haven't started writing the second edition yet.
Oh, give me a couple of years.
Okay. Well, that's so cool. Well, in the book, one of the key elements of the book is you talk about your TESS model of brain health. Can we spend a little bit of time talking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the kind of the journey of the book is it opens with a history of a little bit of neuroscience, a little bit of a history of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and acknowledging that as a professional neuroscientist, we neuroscientists have not done a great job turning stuff that we've done in the lab into practical applications in humans. Like we need to start holding our hands up and admit that. And I think part of that is because of the way that we've approached it, which is, if we can just explode the brain out and look at each little bit in individual detail, then we can explain the whole, when in reality, that may never be the case. So the idea then is that we can step back, because we know there are these core biological inputs that any organ, especially the brain, requires in order to function at its best. So then I go through all those different areas, things you would expect around exercise, sleep, nutrition, and then it comes together in the 3S model to kind of think about how these pieces interact. So the 3 S's are stimulus, supply, and support. So the overarching kind of thesis of the book is that how we use our brains is the primary determinant of how they function. And I draw a lot of parallels to physical strength or physical fitness, because people might appreciate, or it's easier to appreciate it in your physical body. If you want to get bigger and stronger, the most important thing is that you apply mechanical tension to your skeletal muscles. You have to lift weights, right? That's the stimulus.
Yeah, you need stimulus, yeah.
If you want to get the most out of your training, nutrition is critical, sleep is critical. There are a whole bunch of other things, recovery is critical. But you can't just drink protein shakes and take naps and hope your biceps will get bigger, right? You need to do some work. So this is where, and then the brain seems to be the same. And there are certain types of stimuli that really drive the function and structure of the brain and its networks, particularly those that are susceptible to aging. So complex motor skills, your open skill type sports, ball sports, board sports, social interaction, languages, music, some other like creative processes, creative arts. These seem to have these sort of same core functions in terms of how they maintain the like coherence of the networks in the brain that kind of run everything. So stimulus is critical. And the title is slightly provocative because I think in modern society, we are both understimulated and overstimulated at the same time.
Right.
Yes.
And so like I sort of break that apart. But then once you've stimulated some part of the brain with complex skill learning, then those, as the neurons and astrocytes start to fire, right, you get this thing called neurovascular coupling. They drive dilation of the blood vessels in those areas of the brain to bring in more blood flow, right? Because if you want to do the work, right, you need the substrates
Energy.
to let that happen. You need energy,
Yep.
right? You need oxygen, you need glucose or ketones or lactate, right? So that energy requires good metabolic health. The blood flow requires good cardiovascular health. And then you need some core nutrients that kind of either form the structure or create neurotransmitters, right? So that's the supply bucket, and those things are important too. And so then you stimulate, you bring in all the necessary substrate, but actually adaptation and enhancement of function occurs during rest and recovery, just like with athletes in the gym, right? You don't get stronger in the gym, you get stronger when you recover afterwards. So sleep is critical to that. Then you can support, the reason why this bucket is called support is because there are other things that are going to support that process, like hormones are important, trophic factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor or BDNF, which you can produce with exercise and other things. And then you want to avoid things that inhibit that adaptation process, like excessive alcohol, smoking, air pollution, other causes of systemic inflammation like dental disease, as well as chronic stress, which essentially creates a picture of like overtraining in the brain because it never like fully switches off and gets a chance to recover. So those are the three buckets, but then they also interact, right? So we know that if you identify one major thing for you, right? So maybe it's sleep. If you're going to address some issues with sleep, then we know that blood pressure improves, blood sugar improves. We know that the next day you feel more social, right? So you're going to get more social interaction. We know that you're more likely to engage in cognitively challenging tasks because we try and avoid those when we're feeling tired. So you change one thing and the whole kind of network shifts. So that's why it's not a list of things you have to do. It's kind of like if you tackle one area, everything kind of starts to shift in your favor.
I love this. So I have to just express this. I just think it's so brilliant, and why I think our audience is eating this up, because we talk a lot about the impact of just small 1%, small tiny lifestyle changes that you can make in order to improve various aspects of your health, including cognitive as well as physical. All of these things that you talked about, yes, you talk about nutrients, but majority of this is your daily choices that you make in order to allow and support your brain in a way to perform at a high level or even at a stable level. So I really hope that our audience will walk away from this episode with these practical, tactical tools to truly optimize and maximize their cognitive function for the long run. You're not talking about popping the pill to really perform like a hero that day. It's really all about consistent lifestyle choices that support the brain you want to have 20 years down the road.
Right.
You're absolutely right. But thankfully, what I will say is that, so the subtitle of the book is about staying sharp and preventing dementia. But in reality, like the middle part of the book is about cognitive performance today, right? How do I perform better today? So I feel less brain fog. I feel like I can focus. I can pay attention. I can do the things I need to do. And so what's great is that the things that you do to support your cognitive function today then translate into like dementia, reducing dementia risk in the future. So I think that's important because humans are very bad at doing something now for some unknown benefit 20 years down the line, right? So they need to see, we need to see some payback today, or else we're not going to stick with it. So luckily, both are happening at the same time.
And when we go back and look at this, we talk about this on our podcast often, Tommy, is that the environment, the world that we live in creates pressure that we're responding to. And a lot
Mhm.
of times our response is not a healthy response. And we have to use our prefrontal cortex. We have to take a step back and say, listen, I need to make some choices. I need to make some decisions. And here are some things that I can do. So the question is, are you controlling your world, or is your world controlling you? So when we look at this, I've recently, first of all, I used to be a news junkie. I love the news. Okay. But recently it has just been so negative that I just can't tolerate it.
Mhm.
So I've turned the news off and I am rolling through my podcast episodes that when I get in to go somewhere, I've usually got a podcast I'm listening to, not the news. So this is a change I've made. It's helped me considerably. I go back to my daughter when she was very young, started playing violin, and she was in Suzuki violin. And which means, dad had to learn how to play the I can play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star on a violin, even with these big old paws. But it's and I'll tell you, I have a desire to get another fiddle back so I can play with this a little bit. But these are the little things you can do to stimulate these changes, to break the monotony of the world pushing against you, but then to create the stimulus for you to go ahead and develop and improve.
Yeah, so I think this is going to be different for everybody, but obviously the pressures of the world and the stresses we're exposed to in many ways are beneficial, right? Because they drive growth and adaptation, right? That's what stress is for. It
Sure.
diverts resources so that we can deal with the environment. But there are going to be things ideally that we can remove that cause us stress. That's one part of dealing with stress. There are other ways we can build stress tolerance. We can improve our ability to manage our emotions in the moment. But if we can remove things that are causing unnecessary stress, that's great. So for you, it's the news. There's any like untold number of things that it could be for an individual. The most important thing, and this also relates to how we interpret like health information and all these lists of things that we're supposed to be doing, is that what happens is you stop doing, and this luckily probably wasn't the case for you, but right, you stop listening to the news and you get some potential benefits for not being exposed to the stress of listening to the news. But in the back of your mind, you're like, am I now a terrible person because I'm not staying fully informed about the world around me? And it's the same with, if somebody tells you have to do 4 hours of zone 2 exercise every week, or else you don't see any benefit. You're like, well, I can only do an hour. Am I going to get any benefit from that? Because I'm not hitting 4 hours, but then I'm obviously not a good enough person because I'm not investing in those 4 hours, right? And so we create these kind of additional stresses in our own head because we're like, well, I'm not doing the thing that I think I should be doing. So yes, find the things that you can remove, but then at the same time, as much as you can, like you just have to let them go, right? Because you end up getting the worst of both worlds. You're not doing the thing, and then you're stressing about not doing the thing, and then
Yeah,
they don't.
we call that having compassion for yourself.
Yeah,
Take a step back, give yourself a break. Don't be so effing judgmental to yourself. And I think it was good that I used effing and not the real word. But you have to have compassion for
Mm.
yourself to take a step back and do this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go for it, then.
Okay, so we've talked about stimulus, the importance of learning, of novelty, of problem solving, getting in social. The monotony reduces the brain's resilience, so we need to break the monotony. Now, let's go down to supply.
Yeah.
Let's talk about fuel, oxygenation, metabolic health, those key elements, and as they relate to cognitive performance.
Yeah, so those sort of 3 areas within supply, the first being good cardiovascular health. When you think about different patterns of dementia, maybe we'll just give a few definitions here. So dementia is the loss of cognitive function to the point where you essentially can't look after yourself from a day-to-day on a day-to-day basis. There are several types of dementia. The most common is Alzheimer's disease. It's somewhere like 60 to 80% of cases of dementia. The next most common is vascular dementia, which is sort of 10 to 20%. And then there are other like Lewy body dementia, dementia associated with Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal dementia. They're less common. And when we think about preventable dementias, which is now what the sort of the neuroscience and neurology communities are talking about, in reality, the bulk of that is going to be Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, which make up 70 to 90% of dementias. And sort of across those, somewhere between 45 and 70% potentially are preventable. And when you look at the brains of individuals which have these dementias after death, which is the main way we've kind of categorized these things,
Right.
which has its own issues, because how a brain looks on a slice under a microscope tells you very little about how that brain functioned in real life. And I tell you, as somebody who looks at brain slices under a microscope, like it's just that's just the way it is. And most people who have Alzheimer's disease also have disease of the blood vessels in the brain. So the majority of dementias have some kind of issues with vascular disease or issues with the blood vessels. So one of the biggest predictors of dementia risk is high blood pressure, which obviously damages the lining of the blood vessels. It starts to drive atherosclerosis. This then makes them stiffer, right? They can't respond and supply bloods to the areas of the brain that they need to. There are some areas of the brain where the blood supply is very fragile, or, there's just a little bit less of it, like the white matter, which makes up like the middle part of our brain. And it's essentially what makes us human. It allows our prefrontal cortices to do those complex things you were talking about, Don. So there are certain areas, and the hippocampus as well, essentially the blood flow to the hippocampus, which is sort of just inside our ears, it's really important for memory. The blood flow is so dense and expansive that proper flow within the hippocampus is supposed to actually be critical for it to function in the first place. So as soon as you start to lose vascular flow or function in the brain and the hippocampus, we start to see declines in function. So blood flow is critical. So this is where you're going to ask a question.
I was going to say, I was going to just jump right into the solution.
Yeah.
How do we increase and optimize blood flow for those who may, are like not the high performing athletes, because obviously they are ideally doing a lot more things right than wrong, but this population that is like trajectory heading toward dementia or higher risk?
Absolutely. So it's a great question and really important. So there are a number of different ways to tackle this, but of course, we know that metabolic disease is a significant cause of high blood pressure. So if high blood pressure is like our leading indicator here, or something that we can easily measure that we know is a risk factor. So treating metabolic disease, cardiovascular exercise, or any type of exercise is really important. Isometric exercise actually seems to be best for improving blood pressure in particular. So
Really?
like wall sits, or where you hold a specific a movement like halfway through,
Old
sort of like exactly. Like Don, you might have done, like do like a mid-thigh pulls, or you put something like a rack, like in a rack, and you just like pull against it as hard as you can. So it's not the weight isn't moving, but you're sort of pulling against it as hard as you can. Those kinds of things seem to be particularly good for blood pressure. And you might consider, like if you need to, you might consider therapy. So I mean, like pharmaceutical therapies. Blood pressure medications are probably the single medication that has the best evidence for dementia prevention if you have high blood pressure, right? So the evidence for other drugs is much less. But randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses of those trials show that if you have high blood pressure and you take a blood pressure lowering medication, you decrease your risk of dementia. Of course, if you can do it by improving metabolic health and through exercise and all that stuff, improving sleep, fantastic. But that should be an option that's available to you. But then anything else that's going to decrease your cardiovascular risk is probably going to translate to improvements in blood flow in the brain.
What would be Sorry. I'm like, I have a million questions in my head. What would be some of the signs of individuals like right now that, okay, my brain is probably not getting enough blood flow? I mean, obviously the lack of nutrients, the lack of oxygen, how does it manifest in a way that people can pinpoint it in their daily lives?
So I think this kind of comes at it from a different direction, but a suggestion that your brain isn't getting enough blood flow will probably be based on how sedentary you are during the day. So there are several studies now that show that the more time you spend being sedentary, the higher risk of dementia. But it's not that you can't sit down during the day. It's extended periods of being sedentary. So like if you're sitting down for several hours at a time without getting up and moving around, that significantly increases dementia risk. But you might sit for 8 or 10 hours a day. But if you're getting up every hour and like moving around, and like that offsets a lot of it. And when you do studies in the lab, what happens if you sort of sit still for 2 or 3 hours, cognitive function starts to slowly decline. And it's related to decreases in blood flow to the brain as you just kind of just like sit there. And so if that's happening all the time, and I think this is one of the reasons why people feel like groggy or foggy if they just like spend hours staring at their phone, because they've basically not moved for hours, and then like their blood flow is decreasing to their brain. So the most important thing is that, you know, you break up extended periods of being sedentary by moving around. And it sounds so simple that you're like, that can't be important. It can't be that important. But like, there was a randomized controlled trial where they took people and all they had them do was have a wearable remind them to stand up regularly during the day, right? And this significantly reduced their blood pressure, almost the same amount as if they'd started taking a blood pressure lowering medication just by getting up. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. So I think if you're spending a lot of time just like laying on the couch or sitting in a chair, that would be my easiest indicator to say there's going to be periods of time where your brain just isn't getting enough blood flow.
And so many people have jobs where they go in and someone expects them to be sitting in a chair for 8 hours doing their thing. And this is where you got to kind of take ownership of your environment. Nothing says you have to sit in a chair. Nothing says you can't get a stand-up desk. Nothing says that you can't replace your chair with a fizz ball and have to stabilize on this, the whole thing. These are all choices you can make. Now, one of the other challenges that we have on this supply thing is that nutrition, and we've been told for years and years that your brain, its favorite fuel is sugar. I don't think that's the case. I think that's a point that's been made by, regardless who's made it, let's not go down that rabbit hole, but our brain likes all fuel. It loves creatine, the fuel that drives our short-term energy systems. Our brain loves ketone esters too, loves ketones as well. When we're producing ketones, when we're fasting, we get sharp. I mean, there's an evolutionary connection there. And I just heard you say that there's a connection between metabolic disease and late-term cognitive decline.
Mm-hmm.
So metabolic disease is a function of sugar and insulin and carbohydrates. It sounds to me like a ketotic diet with appropriate supplementation may also be an important step.
So I'll address the first thing first. So when you look at, again, big meta-analyses, individual studies, the other significant metabolic predictor or cardiovascular predictor of cognitive decline and dementia is high blood sugar. So if you have prediabetes, cognitive function declines more rapidly than if you have normal blood sugar. And if you have type 2 diabetes, that decline is even faster. And there are studies that show that, looking at the same individuals over time. And in big meta-analyses, if you look at the components of metabolic syndrome, so that's high blood pressure, high blood sugar, a low HDL cholesterol, high triglycerides, and elevated waist circumference, then blood pressure and blood sugar are the two most important predictors. So, yes.
And it's not solved with an insulin shot.
No, it's absolutely not.
This is important.
An insulin shot, but I do think that the large population use of GLP-1s might decrease dementia burden at the population level, right? Because they have an incredible effect on metabolic health in those who need them. So we might be changing the course of history with dementia because of these therapies. Honestly,
yes.
So you're right that anything that we can do to improve metabolic health, improve blood sugar control is going to be important. I don't think we need to go on a ketogenic diet to prevent dementia as long as we maintain good metabolic health. But you're right that there is some evidence that in individuals who are experiencing some cognitive decline and other conditions, so like there's some evidence in bipolar and some other psychiatric conditions, then ketogenic diets or supplementing with some kind of exogenous ketone. The Alzheimer's study, the Alzheimer's studies used MCTs, right? So medium chain triglycerides. Mm-hmm. And this is important, we think, because when you look at glucose uptake into the brain, one of like the kind of the sort of the standard expected things you see in Alzheimer's disease is that less glucose is getting into the brain. You can do these FDG PET scans, so like labeled glucose, see if it's getting into the brain. In the trial where, Stephen Kinane's trial where they gave medium chain triglycerides, the glucose regulation didn't change, but you saw an increase in uptake of labeled acetoacetate. So you were getting more of a ketone body into the brain, and that was associated with some improvements in cognitive function. So you're kind of like bypassing this step where maybe glucose is struggling to get into the brain. However, one interesting thing is that when you look at glucose getting into the brain, it doesn't tell you is it that glucose can't get in, or is it that the brain isn't asking for glucose in the first place? Like, is it supply or demand? And there are studies in particularly early Alzheimer's disease that show that if you stimulate the brain with a cognitive task, glucose can get in just fine. So some of the reason why glucose uptake into the brain decreases in Alzheimer's is because the brain isn't asking for it, because we're not using those
So
parts of the brain.
lazy.
Interesting.
Yeah. So both things are important. Don't get me wrong, like metabolic health is critical, but like the stimulus side is important as well. So like think about muscles, right? Muscles are our main glucose sink. But in an individual with type 2 diabetes, they're already taking up more glucose because they're like, we need to get rid of it somehow. But they've reached a point where they can't take any more. The only way to get more in is to start moving those muscles so you create demand for that glucose to come through. And I think some of the same thing is going on in the brain at the same time. So metabolic health, fueling, critical. Ketones do seem to be beneficial. And I want to see more high quality trials, if I'm honest.
Right.
There are some studies. So Jonathan Little's group at UBC, they've done ketone ester studies in type 2 diabetes and obesity. And like sometimes the ketones improve cognitive function, sometimes they don't.
I see.
And Andrew Kuknick and the group at HMC have done something similar. You know, again, it's sort of like operators. You know, sometimes the ketones improve cognitive function, sometimes they don't. So I think we're still trying to figure out exactly the set of scenarios and the type of supplementation that's going to be beneficial. But certainly some promise. But if you maintain good metabolic health overall, then I think your brain will use whatever substrate you give it.
That's awesome.
And you mentioned a couple of things about using our brain in terms of doing cognitive tasks. Based on your research, what are some of the most impactful cognitive tasks that you have found and have seen to have the biggest bang for our buck? I mean, I've seen, you mentioned language learning, and then there's dancing. I've heard people talk about cursive writing. What are some of the skills that we should be practicing?
Yeah, so the writing is an interesting one because actually that's shown up in a few studies as well, just like this process of physical writing, which nobody seems to do anymore. But I think that the way that I think about it is that the most important skills are ones that are kind of uniquely human, that require the rapid processing of multiple of information from multiple senses, if that makes sense. I say it that broadly because there's evidence that tons of different activities can have very similar effects on the brain. So if you take older adults and you teach them a language or you teach them music skills, both will result in improvements in executive function, right? And processing. So you don't have to do both. Like pick one that feels good to you. And there's an additional, so if we think about physical exercise, there's obviously the benefit of the aerobic component and fitness, cardiovascular fitness. There's a benefit of like resistance training because it does some magical stuff like releasing IGF-1 that supports white matter in the brain. But if you compare an exercise that has a coordinative component, right, you're constantly having to adapt to the environment or another person or strategize, right? You're playing tennis, you're trying to figure out how do I manipulate my opponent so I can get the ball past them, right? And it requires rapid processing of information. If you compare those kinds of sports to just like cycling or running or lifting weights, those are beneficial, but there's an additional benefit from that kind of like complex, fast processing kind of movement. So those are kinds of ways that we can get additional benefits to the brain. And when you look at across multiple different types of stimuli or skills, there was a really nice paper that came out recently called Creative Experiences and Brain Clocks. And what they did was they took a whole bunch of different data sets that measured electrical activity in the brain with an EEG to look at how, you look at networks and how they function. So it's not just like what's happening in one part of the brain, it's how are these things coherent? How are they forming these complex networks that allow us to do all these like amazingly complex things? And there are specific networks in the brain that are susceptible to aging, like the frontoparietal network, which is really important for like focus and attention. And they found that experts in creative skills, and we're talking dancing, art, languages, music, and even like video games, like complex video games, because they have, again, this sort of like multi-sensory, fast processing, decision-making, problem-solving kind of part.
Very flow generating. These are activities that are very enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you look at experts or when you do randomized controlled trials where you have somebody learn these skills, you see the same kind of benefits in in these networks in the brain. So that just says that, like, pick something that you're not very good at, that you want to get better at, and that involves, multiple senses and having to process information quickly, like respond to a training partner, respond to a video game, playing in an ensemble, right? So you're having to, like, listen to other people while you're playing your own instrument, having a conversation in another language, right? Because you're having to respond to them and kind of, like, process the information as well as think about what you want to say in response. All of those things seem to have these sort of, like, same core benefits for the brain.
Wonderful.
Very cool.
So cool.
Now, when we take a look at this now, archaeologists tell us that we evolved to find food and mate. Those are the two things. I believe there's a third element, and it's called confirmation bias. I think we love confirmation bias possibly more than the other two. But I know when I start working with an athlete, literally the first thing I teach them to do is journal, written journal, they all want to go to their phones and type with their thumbs. And I'm like, nope, we're not doing that. We're going to a written journal. And this is something we use this to work out all the key elements, because I think the way I understand it is that learning starts in the motor cortex, and we've got to stimulate that there, and we're missing that with keyboards and swiping screens. So as we take a look at that, I think that's important. You've mentioned aerobic fitness, and I believe in the book you actually mentioned zone 1, 2, 3, not really worrying about 4 and 5, but investing, having compassion in yourself. You don't need to leave sweat spots on the floor from exhaustion to get the benefit of aerobic exercise. In fact, you may not need to break a sweat. Now, I think sweating is important. I don't want to minimize that, but there's benefit that comes early and fast.
Yeah. So like I said, I think I have this idea of what I call a movement funnel, which you kind of, like, move through, sort of like adding as you go. And so, like, the entrance to the funnel is what I call snack, right? So this is just that idea we talked about earlier. Just, like, don't be still all day, right?
Right.
Get up and do some kind of movement, right? People who've never done exercise before, if they do 20 seconds of stair climbing 3 times a week, they improve cardiovascular fitness. Like, isn't that incredible? Like, isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
So, like, just any kind of movement is great. And then the next level is propel, which is just walk, move around for more extended periods. Walking, the more steps you take in a day, up to sort of like 8 to 12,000 steps, the lower your risk of dementia. But it could be cycling, it could be rowing, it could be propelling a wheelchair, right? But any of those things. Then, so, like, that might be enough for most people, right? If you take older adults who are sedentary and you have them walk briskly, they build muscle mass and strength, right? That's enough of a stimulus for them to get stronger. Yes, there is benefit to working hard. And so, like, I do have, like, a sprint level. And that's because lactate that you produce when you do that kind of exercise has a magic effect on the brain. It switches on the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Like, everybody has kind of been, like, bagging on lactate for decades. Lactate is the signal. I think one of the main signals that when we do hard work with our bodies, lactate goes into the brain, and as much lactate as you produce gets into the brain, right? There's like a free flow of lactate through the monocarboxylate transporters, and it switches on brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So it's part of saying, hey, we did something hard. Now let's kind of support the adaptation processes in the brain that are part of that stimulus.
George Brooks has done an amazing job of what I call decriminalizing lactate. So I think this is important to take a look at. And in fact, I was having a conversation with someone the other day that's working on a lactate supplement, a lactate ester supplement.
Yeah.
And it completely boggles your mind when you think about this, because lactate used to be the enemy. And now I'm hearing, okay, it's actually a transporter. It's an energy transporter. The acid is separate from that.
Yeah.
But this is, I've been teaching metabolism for 40 years, and lactate has been the enemy until George Brooks. And now you're backing it up. This is going to be an interesting shift in the whole process.
Yeah. I think so. Lactate. Yeah. So it's a signaling molecule, right? But it's also an energy substrate.
Right.
The shifts in lactate usage are seen sort of like in traumatic brain injury. This is obviously some of the fundamental work that George Brooks has done. I don't know yet whether lactate supplementation as a treatment is going to be like the next big thing. I'm looking forward to those studies being done.
Sure.
Because there's always going to be a case of, right, if we give, so in the setting of brain injury, if we give the brain more energy, can it even like utilize that energy when you have like mitochondrial dysfunction as like a core part of that injury. So that these are open questions that I'm excited to learn more about. But you're right that the lactate does a lot of interesting things that we should, really give it credit for.
The science is not settled.
Yeah, no,
It is changing fast.
100%. Yeah.
So let's go to your third S, support, sleep, stress reduction, recovery. Listen, we spend a lot of time. We talk about my rocks in the jar: movement, nutrient dense food, sleep, and light. And then you have to have purpose. The jar is purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this fits your model pretty well. Back to the confirmation bias that I'm enjoying right now. But we talk about sleep, getting that in, and we've spent a lot of time talking about it. Autonomic balance. And for our audience, when we're talking about autonomic balance, this is what we're talking about when we spend so much time talking about HRV. Our ability to shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic. We can measure that. We have tools for that. There are guides for that. But then there are recovery strategies as well. Tommy, when you take a look at this, when we look at recovery strategies, either from, I like to talk about the athlete, the athlete's parent, and the athlete's grandparent. Let's go to the grandparent. What is a recovery strategy that they can integrate to get that 1% shift?
So if I think about the grandparent, I'm going to imagine somebody who's retired and is now in their sort of maybe like 70s or older. So I'm actually, for them, I'm going to come at this from the other direction. Some of the most, right, if we think about recovery and adaptation in the brain and sleep being probably the most important, there are others that are important too, but sleep is critical, right? That's when information is consolidated, processed, and so the slate is wiped clean, everything's cleared out, right? So that you can go back and you can do it again the next day. For them, I think more stimulus is critical. They need more exercise and they need more cognitive stimulus. There are studies in older adults, randomized controlled trials, where they have them do a cognitive training program and then they sleep better because stimulus drives the signal for sleep, right? And exercise is the same. We know if we exercise more, we sleep better. And it's because you're driving pro-sleep or sleep initiating processes in the brain that then help you sleep better. So I think most people in that age category need to do more stimulus, and then they'll get greater recovery because they're kind of driving that signal.
No wonder
Very
people
good.
in Florida are loving pickleball. It's stimulating both their brain
100%.
and their body, and it's
100%. Yeah.
Seriously.
I'm all about it. That's great.
Yeah.
So listen, we're burning through our time with you pretty quick here, and I
so
want
much to
to
say.
be cognizant of that. I want to drop down to the scope of the issue. I was doing a quick little search. Is 1.5 to 3 million people are affected by head injury in auto accidents every year in the United States. And we think that number is probably half of what's actually happening. That's what's being reported. And the number is ironically very similar in athletics. 1.5 to 3 million athletes are concussed. Listen, I was concussed 3 times in one day, knocked out cold twice, had another shot to the head that started it. I didn't say anything to anybody because I knew when the trainer found out I got knocked out, I was out of practice. So nothing got reported. And there's a lot of that goes on. So we know there's a lot of traumatic head challenges. I didn't want to use the term TBI, but there's a lot of traumatic.
Kinetic brain injuries is one.
Kinetic brain injury. Very good. Yes, there's a lot of that goes on. And there's a lot of people who have moved through this and they're kind of, okay, they may have brain fog. They may not be performing. And in my mind, we go back to our 3 S's. A lot of times the class of athlete I'm work with are academic athletes. They're either in high school or college. So there's a lot of stimulus taking place. We've got to get it fixed, but then we drop down to supplementation. And I shared a paper with you that we did on neurocognitive performance. And when we're looking at these athletes, is there someone listening to this out there? Or if there's someone who's had a head injury from a car accident and they don't feel like they're performing well, is the first thing you recommend creatine from a supplementation standpoint?
Yes, usually. I think there are a couple of small trials actually in the pediatric traumatic brain injury population that suggest that creatine supplementation can accelerate recovery. But in terms of high quality evidence in humans, that's about it, particularly for after injury. The animal evidence suggests that it's better to have the creatine on board beforehand.
I agree.
If you're, and this is just it's such a super low risk strategy to take. if you're somebody who's an athlete and you're a risk of concussions, I mean, having creatine on board is a no-brainer. It's super low risk with high potential for benefit. I'll give an example. There was a study done in high school football athletes, and they did brain MRI scans, or actually they did MRS scans, magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which you can use to measure the levels of different compounds in the brain, including creatine and choline as well. And choline would be another thing that I'd recommend, particularly acetylcholine. So across a season, right, they scanned them before and afterwards, and it looked like, in proportion to the number of subconcussive impacts that they were exposed to, these kids, there was a decrease in creatine in certain parts of the brain, and choline too. And this is thought to be one of the reasons why people experience second impact syndrome, which is that right, you have the first concussion, and you think you feel fine. You go back and play, a few days later, and then you have another concussion, and you have a disproportionate response to that one. Like, the impact was even less, but you have an even worse response to it. And it's potentially, right, there's a whole bunch of things that could be going on, but it could be that because you've depleted some of your energy substrate, you've lost some creatine in the first impact, then you have less energetic buffer when you have the next injury. So again, like, creatine is something super low risk. Plus, if we think about some of the, this is again sort of drawing from multiple strands of evidence, but if you think about some of the symptoms you might experience after long-term after concussion, sleep disturbances, depression, creatine has been shown to improve those things, right? Randomized controlled trials of creatine in depression, improving or offsetting some of the effects of sleep deprivation on like skills and cognitive function. So again, like, multiple reasons why it's something that's worth being part of.
So creatine makes a lot of sense. And are you a 10 milligram a day? Let's get past the 5. Let's get up to 10.
Yes. So I think, I would generally dose by body weight, if I'm honest, especially if you're working with youth athletes. So then we're talking kind of, 0.1 to 0.2 grams per kilo. So that's going to, for somebody like me, that's going to be 10 to 20 grams. But, for smaller individuals, they would need less. And, maybe you increase it, for a short time period after a head impact, or, the setting of sleep deprivation. But something like that is probably going to get people most of the way.
Now, you just mentioned choline and acetylcholine. So for our audience, the major neurotransmitter in the brain is acetylcholine. It makes sense. If it drops, you're going to have lower performance. How do you recommend supplementing choline?
Yeah. So the form that has the best evidence for it around brain trauma is citicoline or CDP choline. They're the same thing. And the trials use 500 to 1,000 milligrams per day. And so that's, if you're a youth athlete, that's like just like the equivalent would be like just 2 or 3 eggs a day, right? That's going to get you that much.
Primarily egg yolks, right?
And
egg yolk,
the yolk specifically, right? It's not in the whites. But if you want to supplement, then sort of 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day is where the evidence is. And there are some trials in older adults with some evidence of cognitive impairment where similar supplementation with citicoline has some benefits on cognitive function.
What about acetylcholine esterase inhibitors? So the acetylcholine esterase is the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine for our audience, and we can inhibit that. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. These are used as frontline therapies in Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
Right. That because they help to manage symptoms. This is because acetylcholine is critical for the encoding, well, first for focus and attention, but then also for encoding memories. And so early on in Alzheimer's disease, people might take an acetylcholine esterase inhibitor in order to kind of maintain some of that choline signal, because like cholinergic signaling in like the basal forebrain is really critical for all these sort of basic cognitive processes. But it doesn't change the course of the disease. Like, at some point, right, you're not kind of changing the underlying biology. So I haven't heard anything about using these in concussion, so I would probably steer clear of that. But certainly some evidence for maintaining function in individuals who have evidence of cognitive decline, because they're used for that.
So in these kinetic brain injuries, one of the biggest challenges is inflammation. That we have this trauma that's inflammation, and this is where sugar starts to become a problem. We want to lower that. This is where we were talking about ketogenesis a little bit ago. Omega-3s have been shown to be very important in here.
Absolutely. Yep.
So would you recommend that same athlete or that same person who wants to be cognitively sharp supplement omega-3 fats?
Yes. Yeah. So again, there are now 2 or 3 different randomized controlled trials in Division 1 football players that show that supplementing with omega-3s during the season decreases the accumulation of molecules that kind of signal some potential brain injury, like neurofilament light is one that can accumulate in the blood. So yes, 2 to 3 grams of omega-3s per day, getting at least 1 to 2 grams of DHA seems to be really, really critical. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that should be just part of the daily.
Okay, now one of the things that omega-3s do is they eventually get enzymatically converted to specialized pro-resolving mediators, which
Yeah.
we can supplement directly now. Now, I don't know that there's any direct evidence in humans yet that SPMs contribute, but I think it makes sense. If you're pulling that thread, it probably makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, so to be honest, I don't yet know, because what we don't have evidence for is whether, say, SPMs are bioavailable and then get where you want them, which is in the brain. Whereas we know that we have specialized uptake transporters that kind of direct DHA into the brain so that it can be turned into things like neuroprotectin D1, which is one of the important SPMs that comes from some DHA. So yes, I think that the theory is good, but I haven't seen good evidence that these, like, if you take them orally, they get where you want them to go. So that's why I've tended to focus on just taking omega-3s or eating seafood, because we have better evidence there.
Sure. Ketone esters, again, trying to lower inflammation in the brain, now have the science that we don't have to wait on producing ketones cellularly, that we can actually ingest them. Does it make sense to add, if I've got someone who I'm struggling with and I want to supplement this, there's probably there's probably a good, again, pull the thread to say, maybe a ketone ester is not a bad supplement.
Yeah. So for 2 potential reasons. One is, if you're trying to maintain stable blood sugar after an injury, and we see so we have multiple things. If you have elevated blood sugar at the time of an injury, right? So if you have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes when you have a brain injury, then your outcome tends to be worse. And you get big swings in blood sugar as a result of the injury, but we want to try and maintain blood sugar as stable as possible, then so I would absolutely get rid of any kind of refined carbohydrate or anything like that. Like, if you get a concussion, don't like chug Powerade as they're like wheeling you off the field.
Yeah.
So then an alternate, like ketones is an alternative substrate. Great. Yes, they may have some anti-inflammatory properties, but also ketones are at least during initial brain development, ketones are the preferred synthetic substrate for making structures in the brain like cholesterol and fats. And so if you're trying to repair a brain, it does kind of make sense that you have the substrate that you need, that you use to build the brain in the first place. So if I got a kinetic brain injury of some kind, I would take exogenous ketones. We recently published a review paper of all the different nutritional strategies and supplements that are out there for concussions and traumatic brain injuries. When we got to ketones, we're like, we think they're promising, but we just don't have really high quality evidence yet. This is 2 different answers. One is, like, Tommy personally would take some ketones. If like somebody said, "Hey, Tommy, with your professor hat on, is there good evidence in humans?" I have to say no, but there's a good reason to think that they might be beneficial. And I'm really looking forward to those trials being done. Like, they're really critical.
Yeah.
Like, this could be a game changer as long as somebody does that study.
Listen, we've exhausted our time with you, and I
Yes. Oh my
apologize because I
could
still
stay
have a
another
long.
hour.
I still want to talk about methylene blue. I want to talk
yeah.
about PEA. I want to talk about red light. I want to talk about vagal nerve stimulation.
Yeah.
So, but we don't
we'll
have
have you
the
back.
time. Tommy, thank you so much for being our anniversary guest.
Yes.
What a pleasure.
We couldn't have asked for anybody better. If the stimulated brain, we can find it wherever you buy books.
Pre-order,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So the Stimulated Mind, go to wherever you normally buy books, Amazon, bookshop.org, whatever. If you go to thestimulatedmind.com, all the details are there, or on my website, drtommywood.com. And then, equally head to Instagram at Dr. Tommy Wood, and sort of all the links and all my podcasts
We'll
and
link
kind
them
of those things
in
are there.
the show notes.
Thank you.
And Tommy, you have a great podcast.
Oh yeah, thanks.
That you do.
Yes.
Yeah, the Better Brain Fitness podcast. It's mainly wherever you get podcasts, but it's also you get it earlier on Substack. So if you go to the URL betterbrain.fitness, and you can sign up for that takes you straight to Substack, and you can do the free one. You don't have to pay or anything. And this is with my friend Josh Turknett, who's a neurologist, and we answer questions. So you can submit questions.
Excellent podcast.
So
Yeah,
great.
thank you so much. Yeah, and so like any questions you have about any of this, send them to us and we will gladly tackle them.
Thank
So
you, Tommy.
please like, share, subscribe. That really helps us move forward. We talked about where you can find Tommy. You can find me at trainrecoverwin.com. You can find me on the Instagram or the website. You can find us on LinkedIn. If you have questions, reach out. Tommy, I am so grateful. Thank you for spending an hour with us.
Thank you so much. And can't wait to see you on all the other platforms you are hopping on soon.
Thanks. And thank you both. This was fantastic.
This was great. Thank you. Bye.